Imagine a scenario, a luxurious, gigantic ship, a true masterpiece of engineering at the time, setting out on its maiden journey. You already know what I'm talking about, don't you? The Titanic, the ship that sank in 1912, taking with it more than 1,500 lives and leaving a legacy of tragedy and fascination that spans generations. Everyone knows this story, and you've probably seen movies, read books, or heard reports about the tragedy that would never be forgotten. But the Titanic, despite its fame, is just a drop in the vast ocean of maritime disasters that have marked the history of humanity. Now, imagine a shipwreck almost 9 times more fatal than the Titanic. Yes, 9 times. While the Titanic took 1,517 lives, another ship, which few have even heard of, took more than 9,000 people to the bottom of the sea. Can you imagine the scale of this? The pain, the panic, the chaos? Today we're going to delve into these dark and little-known stories. Let's revisit tragedies that not only surpassed the Titanic in numbers, but also in human and historical impact. Before we continue, think for a moment. How is it possible that such devastating tragedies have fallen into oblivion? Why do we know so much about the Titanic, but almost nothing about these other maritime disasters? This is the question that guides our journey. Get ready to discover stories so shocking that they may completely change your perception of what it means to be at the mercy of the sea. And to begin with, I'll tell you one of the most emblematic stories. That of SS Sultana, a ship that was supposed to be a symbol of freedom, but ended up becoming one of the greatest tragedies in naval history. But before diving into this story, I need to ask you, are you prepared to explore the depths of the darkest waters in our history? After all, what you will see today is not just about shipwrecks, but about lives, dreams, and futures that were tragically cut short. And remember, this is just the beginning. The story of the SS Sultana begins like so many others, with hope. It was April 1865, and the American Civil War was over. One of the bloodiest conflicts in American history was finally coming to an end, and thousands of Union soldiers who had been held as prisoners of war were eager to return home. Imagine these people's relief. After years of battle, suffering, and incarceration, the nightmare was ending. It was time to reunite with families, hug loved ones, and start a new life. The SS Sultana, an elegant steamship, was chosen for this mission. With a projected capacity to carry 376 passengers, she was far from being a sea giant, but she was a reliable vessel with her steam boilers and robust hull. However, in that fateful month of April, the Sultana was overloaded in a way that defied all logic. It did not carry 376 people, not 1,000, not 2,000. When it set sail from the port in Memphis, there were more than 2,100 people on board. Soldiers, crew, and even civilians, all crammed into a vessel that was not prepared to support so much weight. Why did this happen? The answer is disturbingly simple. Money. The United States government paid shipping companies a generous amount for each soldier they took back north. What was supposed to be a humanitarian operation quickly became a race for profit. Overcrowding, security. None of that mattered. The more soldiers, the greater the profit. And that's exactly what happened with the SS Sultana. On April 27, 1865, as the ship made its way up the Mississippi River, carrying those exhausted and hungry soldiers, tragedy struck. One of the steam boilers exploded. The force of the explosion was so devastating that it practically split the ship in half. Fragments flew into the air, and a shower of embers and red-hot metal fell on the passengers. The initial explosion caused the deaths of dozens of people instantly, but the true horror was yet to come. With 3 of the 4 boilers destroyed, the ship quickly became engulfed in fire. The flames spread with terrifying speed, consuming everything in their path. Those who were not killed by the explosion faced a terrifying dilemma: burn to death or jump into the Mississippi River, where icy waters and treacherous currents awaited. Try to imagine this scene. People screaming, crying, jumping into the water in despair, many not knowing how to swim. And those who survived the explosion and fire still faced another enemy: hypothermia. Mississippi, at that time of year, was deadly cold. Of the more than 2,100 passengers on board, about 1,800 died. It was a tragedy of unimaginable proportions, and yet the SS Sultana is not remembered like the Titanic. He is a name forgotten in the pages of history, but perhaps most harrowing of all is the context. Many of these soldiers had survived years of war, famine, disease, and imprisonment. They had escaped death so many times, only to meet it at the moment they most believed they were safe. This is the kind of tragedy that doesn't just affect numbers, it destroys dreams, families, and futures. And now I want you to think, have things changed that much? How many times in our lives have we placed our trust in something or someone, only to be betrayed by selfish interests? This story is a powerful reminder of how human choices, greed, neglect, recklessness, can turn hope into despair. But the SS Sultana is just the beginning. The next shipwreck we will explore has an even more chaotic scenario, with explosions, desperate refugees, and an impressive number of victims. You won't want to miss it. Before we continue, how about helping keep these stories alive? Subscribe to the channel right now and leave your like on this video. It's free, it takes seconds, and you help us bring more stories that the world has forgotten, but that need to be told. After all, the past has a lot to teach us about the present. Don't waste time. Click the subscribe button and let's explore the darkest waters of history together. Imagine living in a war-torn country where every decision could be the difference between life and death. This was the scenario in China in 1948, when the Civil War was at its height. On the one hand, the nationalist forces of the Kuomintang, on the other, the rising communists. The country was divided, chaos was absolute, and for many civilians, fleeing was their only chance to survive. In the midst of this turmoil, the SS Kiangya appears, a steamship that promised to take thousands of refugees away from the conflict, but which, tragically, would become the scene of one of the greatest maritime tragedies in history. The Kiangya was a relatively modern ship for the time, with an official capacity to carry 1,186 passengers. But like the SS Sultana, it was irresponsibly overloaded. When he left the port of Shanghai on December 4, 1948, he was carrying much more than was allowed. Officials registered 2,150 passengers, but thousands of desperate refugees boarded clandestinely, filling every corner of the ship. It is estimated that there were more than 4,000 people on board that fateful day. Now I want you to put yourself in the shoes of these passengers. Imagine the terror of leaving everything behind: your home, your family, your city. What would you take with you if you knew this could be your only chance of survival? On board the Kiangya, entire families were huddled together, bringing only what they could carry. There was a tense atmosphere, mixed with a small spark of hope. But that hope would be brutally snatched away in a matter of hours. Just 80 kilometers from Shanghai, a devastating explosion ripped through the ship's stern. The impact was so violent that it split the vessel in half, throwing hundreds of people into the water instantly. What caused the explosion? Many believe the Kiangya hit a mine left behind from World War II, a lethal weapon forgotten at the bottom of the sea, waiting to claim more victims. Think about it for a moment. A war that had already ended years before still had the power to destroy innocent lives. How many times does the past come back to haunt us in ways we never expected? This is one of the tragedies of the SS Kiangya. It was not just the victim of an accident, but of a legacy of destruction left by other conflicts. The explosion was just the beginning of the horror. Most of the stowaways were unregistered, meaning no one knew for sure how many people were on the ship. And as expected, help was slow to arrive. The surrounding waters were freezing, and many who survived the explosion died of hypothermia before any rescues could be carried out. In the end, it is estimated that between 2,750 and 3,920 people lost their lives in the disaster, but the exact number will never be known. Now ask yourself, how can such a huge tragedy be practically forgotten? Why doesn't the SS Kiangya, with its thousands of victims, receive the attention we give to other disasters? Is it because it happened in a country already devastated by other tragedies? Is it because many of the victims were refugees, people without a voice or power to tell their story? These questions are unsettling but important. They remind us that in human history, some lives seem to weigh more than others. But here, in this space, each of these lives matters. Each of these stories deserves to be told. Kiangya teaches us something powerful. Even when all seems lost, the quest for survival connects us to our most basic humanity. The refugees who boarded that ship did so because they believed in a chance, no matter how small. They believed they could find a place where their families would be safe. And this is a struggle that resonates with all of us. After all, who wouldn't do the same to protect the ones they love? But if you think the SS Kiangya was devastating, get ready for the next story. We are just beginning to explore the horrors of the sea. The upcoming sinking involves not only thousands of lives, but also a direct, calculated, and absolutely ruthless attack during World War II. It's the kind of story that makes you question how far humanity is capable of going in times of war. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and leave your like. It's a simple way to ensure stories like these aren't forgotten. Together, we can keep alive the memory of those who lost their lives in tragedies like this and learn from the mistakes of the past. Click the subscribe button now and come with us to discover more hidden chapters of history. After all, the waters still have many secrets to reveal. The story of the SS Goya is a cruel reminder of how war turns lives and dreams into grim statistics. It is 1945, in the final months of the Second World War. Europe was in ruins, Nazi Germany was collapsing, and Soviet armies were advancing mercilessly across Eastern Europe. Amid this chaotic scenario, millions of civilians were desperately trying to escape the combat zones. It was an exodus from a shattered continent, mothers, children, wounded soldiers, and the elderly, all looking for a way out. The SS Goya would be the last hope for many of them, but destiny had other plans. The Goya was a ship originally designed to carry passengers on luxurious voyages. Launched in 1940, she was a sturdy but not particularly large vessel. With an official capacity of 1,500 people, she was quickly converted into a military transport when war broke out. However, in April 1945, the Goya carried neither tourists nor soldiers seeking victory. It was packed with desperate refugees fleeing the fury of the Red Army. And when I say packed, I'm not exaggerating. It is estimated that between 6,000 and 7,000 people were on board, more than 4 times its maximum capacity. Now think about the scene. A ship so crowded there was barely room to breathe. People crowded on the decks, in the corridors, even in the engine rooms. Imagine the sound, the cries of children, the prayers of mothers, the anguished silence of wounded soldiers. They all knew they were fleeing something horrible, but few could have imagined they were sailing straight into an even greater tragedy. On the night of April 16, 1945, the SS Goya sailed through the Baltic Sea, leaving Poland towards Germany. It was a dangerous route, full of Soviet submarines patrolling the waters, ready to attack anything that floated. At around 11:52 p.m., the tragedy happened. The Soviet submarine L-3, commanded by Captain Vladimir Konovalov, fired 2 torpedoes at the Goya. Both hit the ship with devastating accuracy. In a matter of seconds, the Goya was consumed by explosions, its hull torn apart, and a fire began to spread on board. Now imagine the panic. Screams, running, the sound of explosions echoing in the dark night. The ship, already overloaded, began to sink rapidly. In less than 7 minutes, the Goya disappeared beneath the icy waters of the Baltic. 7 minutes. Think about it. The length of a short song, a commercial break. That's all it took for thousands of lives to be lost. Of the estimated 6,000 to 7,000 people on board, only about 183 survived. Yes, you read that right, just 183. And here's a fact that makes this story even darker. Many of the people who died in that sinking were not direct victims of the explosion or immediate drowning. The water temperature in the Baltic Sea that night was around -3 degrees Celsius. For those who fell into the sea, survival time was measured in minutes. Many died of hypothermia before any rescue attempt could be organized. The Goya tragedy is a brutal reminder of how war turns the environment itself into a deadly enemy. But why was Goya attacked? This is a question that still raises debates today. For the Soviets, any German ship was considered a legitimate target, even one loaded with civilian refugees. But for survivors and historians, the attack on the Goya symbolizes the merciless toll of war, where the line between combatants and innocents is easily erased. Goya's story also leads us to a painful reflection. What do we do in moments of despair? Everyone on board that ship knew the dangers. They knew that the sea was full of enemy submarines. But for them, remaining on dry land, waiting for the Red Army to arrive, was an almost guaranteed death sentence. Escaping on the Goya was a risk, yes, but for many it was the only risk worth taking. If there's anything the sinking of the Goya teaches us, it's about the strength and fragility of human hope. Those thousands of refugees boarded the ship, believing they were heading towards salvation. In the end, they found the opposite. And this leads us to a question that echoes to this day. In times of crisis, how much are we willing to sacrifice in the name of survival? If the SS Goya haunts us with its tragedy, the next wreck we explore goes even further. Not only did it claim more lives than any other maritime disaster in history, but it is also a story of hubris, poor decisions, and the unbearable weight of desperate overcrowding. Get ready to learn the story of Wilhelm Gustloff, a name that defines the height of horror on the seas. Before that, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It's a simple way to help us continue telling stories like this, which need to be remembered. Your subscription and likes cost nothing, but they make all the difference so that we can keep alive the memory of events that time has almost erased. Click the subscribe button now, and together, let's explore the darkest chapter in maritime history. The worst is yet to come. For a moment, close your eyes and try to imagine what it's like to be on a crowded ship, where every square meter is occupied by people who have only one thing in common: the desire to survive. It's difficult, isn't it? But that was the reality in Wilhelm Gustloff, the ship that would become the scene of the worst maritime disaster of all time. A ship that promised to save lives, and that, on a freezing night in January 1945, took more than 9,000 people to the bottom of the Baltic Sea. Wilhelm Gustloff's story begins as a celebration. Launched in 1937, she was a luxury ship designed to carry German tourists on cruises across the Baltic Sea. A vessel that symbolized comfort, stability, and national pride. But with the start of World War II, it was requisitioned by the German Navy and transformed into a hospital ship, and later into military transport. On the night of January 30th, 1945, the Wilhelm Gustloff left the port of Gottenhafen, Poland, heading for Germany. On board were more than 10,000 people, soldiers, civilians, women, children, and even wounded. For most, the hope was simple: escape the advancing Red Army, which had surrounded the region. But what they didn't know was that that would be their last destination. The ship was overcrowded to a degree that defies comprehension. Designed to accommodate 1,900 passengers and 400 crew, it carried more than 5 times that capacity. There wasn't enough space for everyone on the decks, much less lifeboats for so many people. And as if that wasn't enough, the winter was relentless. Temperatures were around -18 degrees Celsius, and the icy Baltic water was a certain death sentence for anyone who fell into it. At 9 p.m., the tragedy began. A Soviet submarine, the S-13, commanded by Alexander Marinesko, fired 3 torpedoes at the Wilhelm Gustloff. 2 hit the ship, causing catastrophic damage. The first exploded in the bow, the second hit the center, where many of the refugees were staying. The explosion was devastating, but what followed was even worse. The ship began to sink rapidly, listing alarmingly. In the corridors, chaos took over. Families were separated, screams of despair echoed, and the few rescue teams available struggled to maintain any semblance of order. People were rushing towards the upper decks, but space was limited. Lifeboats were launched in a haphazard manner, some falling into the water empty, others capsizing with excessive weight. As the ship sank, many threw themselves into the sea in a desperate attempt to survive. But the icy water was unforgiving. Hypothermia, exhaustion, and panic caused thousands of lives to be lost before the ship even disappeared beneath the waves. In less than an hour, the Wilhelm Gustloff sank completely, taking with it around 9,400 people. Only 1,200 survived. This was the biggest maritime disaster in history. And yet, how many times have you heard about it? Why is the Titanic so remembered, while Wilhelm Gustloff and so many other tragedies remain forgotten? Perhaps because the Titanic represents more than a shipwreck. It symbolizes the failure of human arrogance. Wilhelm Gustloff is a war tragedy, a story buried under the shadows of an even greater conflict. But this does not diminish its importance. Each of these lost lives deserves to be remembered. So what do we learn from these stories? Perhaps the most important thing is how human beings, even in the face of the worst adversity, seek to survive. Whether on the SS Sultana, the Kiangya, the Goya, or the Wilhelm Gustloff, these people faced unimaginable circumstances, guided by a hope that defied all odds. And that's something that resonates with all of us. Because in the end, what we all want is to find a safe place, a better future. Now, it's your turn to be part of this story. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like and share this video. When you do this, you help us keep these memories alive, to tell stories that time tries to erase. And most importantly, you show that these lives, even those lost in the silence of the sea, still have value. And finally, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening, for reflecting and for caring. Get ready, because the next video will bring equally impactful stories, stories that deserve to be remembered. Until then, take care, keep your curiosity alive, and remember, every story connects us to something bigger. See you soon.